Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 9th of August of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kursk direction. As you can see, we have received significant number of details, updates and geolocations during the previous 24 hours. As you can see, we have adjusted the map, we have added yellow color which confirms complete control over this territory by armed forces of Ukraine. We still have contested area, the area that according to different bloggers, different military experts and mappers was captured by the Ukrainians, but we still haven't received anything to confirm this. So let's start and let's talk in details and step by step. And of course the most important updates this morning, telling the truth more precisely, started with the significant number of videos of how the Russians were redeploying forces in direction of Sudzha. Telling the truth, this is a very not very smart decision by the Russians to show pictures of armored vehicles heading along the highways towards the line of combat contact, because of course from one side all these videos with significant number of tracks allow the Russians to stabilize the situation, to stabilize first of all the minds of people who are currently located in this area. But on the other hand, all these videos, all these pictures that were published during the day with significant number of armored vehicles allow the Ukrainians to understand where exactly the Russians are heading. It's not the space, it's not the universe, it's like a ground with a limited number of roads, with a limited number of places where exactly all these vehicles the Russians are sending to. And of course the Ukrainians know everything, they control everything, and as soon as they see another concentration of forces, of course the Ukrainians do all they can to attack this concentration, because the main purpose of the Ukrainians to ruin the Russian rotation, to ruin the process of redeployment of forces, because the longer the Russians are not able to bring additional forces to the line of combat contact, the more territories the Ukrainians are able to capture. And of course the Ukrainians are trying to do all they can to slow down the Russians, because they understand as soon as the Russians are able to concentrate the critical mass in along the line of combat contact, and if the Ukrainians are not able to create a strong defense before this situation happens, they can be defeated, suffer losses, and the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back on the territory of Ukraine. So that's why the Ukrainians are doing everything to slow down the Russians. And today there was very interesting post published by the Russian sources, and I believe that almost nobody mentioned this post, but I would like to discuss with you. In the morning, the Russian sources start claiming and publishing and spreading the information that Ukrainians, using the Russian phone numbers, begin calling the Russian civilians all over the entire Kursk area with one purpose, telling them that the situation is very critical, that there are very heavy clashes, that Ukrainians are attacking, that Ukrainians soon will enter this or that settlement, basically the settlement where the callers were talking with. And the Ukrainians, these fake Ukrainians who was saying that they're the Russians or from Russian military authorities, were asking, sometimes demanding the Ukrainians to leave their houses, to leave their homes, and to start moving, let's say in safe direction. But the problem is, and the thing is, that Ukrainians were calling not to the Russians who are located in Glushkova, or let's say in Korenevo, or let's say in Zelyony. The Ukrainians were calling the Russians the civilians who were living along the road between Rylsk, then the city of Lvov, and Kursk itself. So the Ukrainians were calling the Russians civilians who are living along the main supply road, the highway in this area, and this is the main support arteria. And basically the call was like asking people to leave their homes, let's say at 7 or 8 or 9 p.m. a.m. of the local time, and to start moving using the safe road towards Kursk in the direction of evacuation zone. And of course, if I be in this situation and somebody called me, represented himself as the military authorities, and if I know that there are clashes in front of near to my city, of course I would follow the order without asking questions whether this real officer of a Russian army or not. And this situation led to complete collapse of Russian logistics, because at some point, probably somewhere between 7 p.m. of the 8th of August till morning of the 9th of August, the main supply road between the cities like Rylsk, then as we discussed, city of Lvov and Kursk, this road was completely collapsed and blocked by the locals, by the vehicles and civilian cars that were heading in safe direction. And that led, first of all, to complete collapse and to big traffic, and big traffic made its job. During the big traffic, the Russian vehicles, the Russian forces that were heading to the line of combat contact were blocked and were stopped. And now the easiest question ever: if there are a significant number of Ukrainian drones, and if the Ukrainian drones see that there is a very big traffic and that some Russian group of forces convoy was blocked during this traffic, what the Ukrainians would do in the next second? Of course, the answer is simple. The Ukrainians would attack these convoys with HIMARS missiles or even with ATACMS missiles. And today, such a situation happened in the vicinity of Rilsk. We will not watch the video published by pro-Ukrainian sources and pro-Russian sources. There is a video that shows significant number of Russian losses exactly in this area. So this is the video, and this is the Russian convoy. As you can see, there are significant number of vehicles: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 vehicles with the personnel that was blocked in this area. And when the Ukrainians discovered this concentration of forces, they start bombing and attacking the Russian convoy with HIMARS. 4 HIMARS missiles reached the center of the convoy. And then, as you can see, a drone was zooming out, and we can calculate additional 5 or 6 tracks with the infantry. We don't know for sure the exact number of losses from the Russian side, but some sources are saying that the Russians, as a result of this HIMARS attack, lost up to 1 or even more battalions. So, telling the truth, summarizing everything, more than 100 soldiers of armed forces of Russia lost their lives exactly along this road, along this street, along this village between Rilsk and Kursk. So this is the situation with the Russian reinforcement. Anyway, regarding the blocks, regarding all these things, the Russians managed to concentrate, to gather forces, to bring additional reinforcement, and the Russians were heading towards the line of combat contact. And the main Russian goal, the main Russian city was by the name of Большое Солдатское. So this is the city the Russians were heading to, because this is another highway, as you can see, and based on this city, based on the city of Большое Солдатское, the Russians were planning to block the Ukrainian positions in Sudzha area from the northeast. So the Russians, first of all, were trying to block the Ukrainians in this area and not to allow the Ukrainian foothold to spread further. So the Russians were trying to do this in Большая Солдатская. The Russians have managed to block the Ukrainians in Korenyevo. During the previous few days, the Ukrainians made lots of attempts to attack this village, but most of the attacks were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians suffered losses and haven't managed to move further. Now, according to information we have, the Russians managed to concentrate forces in Большое Солдатское. And furthermore, if you remember, yesterday we had lots of talks, lots of reports about very heavy clashes in the village of Krymskie Boki. Not Krymskie Boki, in the vicinity of the village Anastasievka. Yes, in Krymskie Boki there were very heavy clashes. We can read this post once again. Yes, there were reports that Ukrainians were moving in this direction, and the main purpose of all these attacks weren't like to capture Kursk nuclear power plant or something like this. From this angle, from this perspective, we can see that this is like something like a buffer zone. So this is the buffer zone by the Russians that they were trying to create and not to allow the Ukrainians to move behind this buffer zone. So it's like something like a barrier, something like a military barrier that the Russians were trying to establish with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to spread their offensive further outside of this barrier. And once again, summarizing everything, the Russians managed to stop the Ukrainians in Korenyevo, but there are still very heavy clashes. The Russians managed to slow down the Ukrainians in Krymskie Boki yesterday, and according to information we received during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to stop the Ukrainians in Большое Солдатское as well. So now we don't know for sure whether the Russians are able to regain their lost positions in Sudzha very fast, but now we can tell for sure, for 100%, that most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to move through or to move out of these 3 cities. They will be blocked in this area, and then the Russians within a month or 2 or 3 months will start counteroffensive with the purpose to restore control. Anyway, this is the stabilization that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation was talking about. Now let's talk about details about what was happening from the Ukrainian side. First of all, let's start from the southern part. According to information we have, the Ukrainian forces, there are few battalions and soldiers and units of different brigades are involved in the southern Sudzha offensive operation. First of all, we are talking about Russian Volunteer Corps, Russian Democratic Republic, and 88th Mechanized Brigade. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians were trying to attack the village of Plikhova. And the forces of Russian Volunteer Corps managed to block the Russians in this area. They haven't entered the village because there was a Russian garrison, and basically the Russian Volunteer Corps decided not to risk and not to lose the manpower. They just blocked, and basically they were trying to secure the flank. Meanwhile, the forces of 88th Mechanized Brigade crossed the river in the area of Milovoy, Kurilovka, and attacked the Russian positions in the villages by the name of Dmitrikov and Makhnovka. And as a result of clashes in this direction, the Ukrainians managed to establish complete control over Dmitrikov, and this post we received just before I begin making the video, so that's why I haven't adjusted the map, but I will adjust the map before the next video and we'll discuss this in details. So summarizing everything, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours on the southern Sudzha flank, the Russians managed to cross the river, the Russians managed to establish complete control probably over Makhnovka, Dmitrikov, and basically the Russians created the semi-encirclement of the rest of Sudzha, and now there are very high risks for the Russians to be encircled. So this is the situation with 88th Mechanized Brigade and Russian Volunteer Corps that are operating in the southern Sudzha direction. Now let's talk about the central Sudzha and the northern Sudzha. As for this territory, this is the area of responsibilities of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade of Armored Forces of Ukraine. During the previous 24 hours, we got a lot of geolocations that confirm Ukraine control and some progress inside of the city itself. In this video, we can see the beginning of attack of 88th Brigade under support of Horn Group FPV drone operators, who are also located and support the Ukrainian forces in offensive. A little bit further to the north, we can see that the Ukrainians have already managed, just during 2-3 days, managed to bring the howitzers M777 as close as possible to Sudzha itself, and now the Ukrainians finished the redeployment of artillery process, and now they support the Ukrainians further deep inside of the territory of Russia. And in this video we can see that the Russians managed to discover one of those M777 howitzers, and as a result of Lancet strike, that howitzer was destroyed. As you can see, the crew, the personnel of this artillery system managed to survive, and they basically hide inside the force that located nearby. So as for Sudzha itself, we have the videos with tanks of 22nd Mechanized Brigade that were under attack of Russian forces, of Russian drones and Lancet. As a result of this attack, the tank was either damaged or destroyed. Also, we have the videos of how the first groups, first soldiers, stormtroopers, most likely of the same 22nd Mechanized Brigade, were operating inside of Sudzha itself, and according to information we have, these are marauders who were stealing different things from different buildings according to the Russians. So based on these geolocations, we have adjusted the map. Right before also we start making the video, we got another let's say geolocation, another photo of Ukrainian soldier who was making a selfie right exactly in this point, right in front of this small small shop by the name of Peterochka. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map as well. See, a small black was added to the territory of Ukraine control. So the Ukrainians, as you can see, according to information we have, most likely weren't entering the most central part of Sudzha because the Ukrainians understood that this might be a suicide operation. Basically, the Ukrainians established, as I understand, according to geolocations, the territory of control along the southwestern, western, and northwestern and northern outskirts of the city by the name of Zaleshenka and Goncharovka and Sudzha. So along the let's say the road that goes right around the city itself. And the main parts of this 22nd Mechanized Brigade, where the main purpose of this brigade was to attack Kazachya Lokhna and the villages in the vicinity of this let's say small village like second Knyazhi and the first Knyazhi. And according to information we have, most likely the Ukrainians managed to capture these villages, and then after they captured these villages, they crossed this territory and made an attempt to attack further in direction of the village by the name of Martinovka. But the sources are saying that the Russian 488th Regiment, who is responsible for defense of Sudzha, managed to repel Ukrainian attack exactly in this area and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. After a very short regrouping, the Ukrainians changed their plans and began offensive in direction of the village by the name of Cherkasskaya Porечная and further to the north in direction of Russkaya Porечная. Currently, we don't know for sure whether the Ukrainians managed to establish complete control over this village, but obviously they're trying, and the Ukrainians were trying to get as close as possible to Большое Солдатское, but most likely most of Ukrainians' attempts were repelled and the Ukrainians managed to stabilize, as we discussed 5 minutes ago. But on the other hand, we received very interesting geolocation exactly from this area, from the vicinity of the village by the name of Yuzhny. In this video, we can see the Ukrainian howitzer. And this is a Gvozdika howitzer that was redeployed by the Ukrainians, as you can see, very close to the line of combat contact. According to the doctrine and the, let's say, documentation, technical documentation, or military doctrine of use of this howitzer, usually the Russians are using, and Ukrainians, they have the same howitzer in their, let's say, military forces. This howitzer can be used within 7-10 kilometers from the line of combat contact. And if we calculate the distance from this point to, let's say, the village of Russkaya Porечная, this territory, the distance in this case is going to be around 6 kilometers. And if we calculate the distance from the same village to Солдатская, Большое Солдатское, in this case the distance is going to be around 16 kilometers. So it's too far for this howitzer, but it's perfect distance to attack, to support Ukraine attack towards Russkaya Porечная, and of course to support Russian attack towards the village of Martinovka. Both cases, the two villages are in the area of Ukrainian artillery forces. So summarizing this part and the mission of this 22nd Mechanized Brigade during the previous 24 hours, they were attacking the village by the name of Martinovka, and this one, the village by the name of Russkaya Porечная. Currently, we don't know for sure whether the, let's say, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over these villages or most of their attacks were repelled. Most likely, we're going to receive updates about the situation tomorrow during the next video or during the upcoming night of the local time. All these attacks were made by the Ukrainians during the progress and offensive operation of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, which was operating from the Ukrainian side in direction of the villages by the name of Viktorovka, Malaya Loknya, and the Ukrainians, according to information we have, according to reports that we've discussed in the previous video, managed to establish complete control over Malaya Loknya. But later we got reports that after the Russians managed to stabilize the situation in the vicinity of Anastasievka and the Krymsky Byki, the Russians launched a series of counteroffensive, and as a result of these counteroffensives, the Russians restored control over the village by the name of this Malaya Loknya, or at least there are very heavy clashes right now. So we need more details, more days to understand what exactly is happening right now in this direction, in the direction of this small city. So now let's move further. Let's talk about the western flank, and now we are talking about the area of control of responsibilities of 82nd Air Assault Brigade and 103rd Defense Brigade. During the previous few days, during the previous 3 days, the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack the Russian forces in Koreniva, but most of those attacks were repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians were forced to fall back, suffering significant losses. So to continue their offensive, the Ukrainians first of all decided to attack the village of Snaga. And according to information we have, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over this territory, and the Ukrainians are using the hills and the grounds, high-rise areas from these Nagas to establish complete fire control over positions of armored forces of Russian Federation inside of Koreniva. So now this city is under complete fire control. The Ukrainians are bombing this territory heavily, and basically they're preparing the ground before further, let's say, attempts to attack this territory. So this area is under complete Ukrainian control. But on the other hand, we receive updates that the Russians made some number of counteroffensive, but for now without any geolocations to confirm this. On the other hand, we receive additional update that the Ukrainians captured Snagas to the south of Koreniva, and also the Ukrainians captured or entered the village of Olgovka from the north, from maybe with the purpose to establish crossfire artillery control from both directions, from the southern direction and from the eastern direction. But anyway, let's say according to the villages around Koreniva, Korenivo. Maybe they were captured by the Ukrainians, but as for Korenivo itself, the city is under complete Russian control, and the Russians are saying that there are no risk of losing the city as a result of Ukrainian offensive. So this is the situation in this area. We understand what was the Russians' meaning by talking about the stabilization of the front line. They were talking about 3 villages, but once again, right before we start making the videos, we discussed the Ukrainians managed to bypass Suja to capture Dmitrikov, and most likely the Ukrainians will try to make attempt to attack in direction of Belitsa. So this area should be stabilized by the Russians as well, because if they are not able to do this, the Ukrainians will be able to enter the operational space and start moving towards the Belgrade from the north. So the Russians need additional cities and additional villages for stabilizations, and most likely this village is going to be let's say in our post, and will be a part of very heavy discussions tomorrow, because for now neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have control or additional forces in this area. Basically nobody managed to bring additional reinforcements for stabilization, so it's a perfect position for attack for Ukrainians, and let's say the Russians need to think how to bring forces here as well for additional, let's say, stabilization of the situation. Now let's move further. Let's talk about other directions. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians stated that they managed to establish additional control over a few more villages. The Russians, according to the group of forces north and some different sources, managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Popovka, and the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Alexandrovka. For now, it's very difficult to understand whether it's true or not, because this information wasn't, let's say, added to the Ministry of Defense report of Russian Federation. Maybe this information is correct, and if this information is correct, of course, the Russians are trying to check the Ukrainian defense in the vicinity of Kurikovka, because it's very important to cut Kurikovka, to cut, let's say, Kharkiv from Sumy area, because to supply and support their forces, to, let's say, have additional, let's say, logistic, the Ukrainians of course also use Kharkiv for these purposes, and to cut this road will reduce the Ukrainian logistic possibilities. On the other hand, to cut the Ukrainians, the Russians need to think about additional offensive if they want to make some from Tyotkina towards Vorozhba. But according to discussions we held the previous time, there is a concentration of Ukrainian forces, and it's the Russian side who need to expect possible counter-offensive from the possible offensive from the Ukrainian side. Now let's move further. As for the old line of combat contact, we haven't received anything special, just regular artillery strikes, just regular drone strikes in northern Kupiansk direction, in the central Kupiansk direction, in the southern Kupiansk direction. We have very heavy artillery preparation in the vicinity of Verkhnyakamyanskaya. So as we discussed, the Ukrainians have concentrated a significant number of forces in Sumy, and it's the best time for the Russians to begin offensive all of the line of combat contact, while the main forces are located somewhere very far from this area. We don't know for sure whether the Russians are going to risk and whether the Russians are going to play all in, but something tells me that this situation can happen. At Chasiv Yar, we got the video published by the Russian sources. In this video we can see the Russian FPV drone who was bringing some water, cigarettes, maybe food, maybe some grenades or bullets to the Russian forces, the Russian soldiers who are currently located on the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. The Russians, this video confirms Russian control and Russian presence on the Ukrainian side and in the central part of Chasiv Yar. But on the other hand, this video confirms that the Russians don't have stable supply and support of their forces here, because most of the positions, most of the roads under complete Ukrainian fire, artillery or FPV drone control. As for Torets, New York, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything from this direction, and I believe that this situation is connected with the Ukrainian offensive in Sumy. And as we discussed yesterday, the Ukrainians are planning to reduce the number of updates from this direction with the purpose to force us to think, and people think, that the Russians stopped here, and during the next days the Ukrainians are planning to focus just in this area, and maybe in 2-3 days we're going to receive additional updates, and something tells me that when the Ukrainians publish additional progress, the progress is going to be significant. And maybe the Russians during the next few days will be able to improve their positions significantly in the direction of Pokrovsk, and maybe the villages like Grodovka, Novogrodovka, or different villages in this area would be captured. So everything is possible. I believe that Zhelana was already captured by the Russians, but still haven't received any reports from pro-Ukrainian mappers or from neutral mappers, because it's like their position. It's not currently it's their politic regarding the situation on the ground and regarding the updates we are receiving. Now let's move to the second most important area, and we're going to talk about Tendra and Kinburg-Spit. On the 6th of August, the Ukrainians made an attempt to attack the Russian forces. They were trying to land their forces in Tendra-Spit, but that attack was repelled by the Russians. Ukrainians suffered losses and were forced to fall back. After a short regrouping, today on the 9th of August, the Ukrainians made another attempt to do the same. They landed their infantry and they managed to get as close as possible to the Russian positions, but the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainians and to destroy them. And we have a lot of videos, a lot of geolocations that confirms that the entire Marine group was completely destroyed. Most likely this is not the last attempt. Most likely the Ukrainians will increase their attempts to do this, and they will intensify their actions exactly in this direction. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack the Russian fleet inside of along Crimea, because now everybody understands that today, tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, the Russians are going to begin full-scale, massive missile strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine, and most likely the Ukrainians will be completely turned off from the energy and electricity, and they're going to become the entire and endless blackout for Ukraine. And of course, for this purposes, the Russians also require to use their missile caliber carriers, and as we can see, the most of caliber carriers most likely currently are blocked by the Ukrainian Navy drones along the Black Sea, with the purpose not to allow the Russians to do this. And I'll remind you that according to the reports we got from the Western countries, they managed to bring significant number of air defense system exactly in this direction, and probably the Ukrainians and the Western countries expect that the Russians are about to launch massive missile strike, and most likely they think that they are ready. And the final thing is that today we got report from the second person in Ukraine, not from Zelensky but from his deputy probably. Now he reported after the beginning of Kursk offensive that we do not see the point in direct negotiations with Russia, at least at that moment. So the Ukrainians are not planning to talk about anything, but telling the truth, I don't think that Putin and Russia itself is going to sit and start any negotiation process with Ukraine until the end of Ukraine. Probably there's going to be no peace anymore, and everybody understands this, everybody. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.